Welcome to the AMBW Soul Romance channel. AMBW Soul Romance is a place for emotional, dramatic, and addictive love stories between Asian men and Black women. Enjoy listening. Please subscribe to the channel to hear more great stories. I married a Korean Mafia boss to save his reputation after a blood scandal. He married me because I once saved his life. But the night his enemy's son bled out on my operating table, I chose to save the boy instead of helping my husband win his war. When people hear that sentence, they assume the story is about betrayal. They assume I fell in love with the enemy or that I wanted revenge. The truth is far less dramatic and far more dangerous. I did it because I am a nurse, and in my world a dying patient is not an enemy. A dying patient is simply someone who needs my hands to move faster than death. 3 years ago, I was working the night shift in a crowded trauma center. The emergency doors burst open just after midnight. Paramedics rushed in with a man soaked in blood. His white shirt turned a dark violet red. 5 gunshot wounds. 1 in the chest, 2 in the abdomen, 1 in the shoulder, 1 grazing the neck. The paramedic shouted numbers while pushing the stretcher toward surgery. Blood pressure collapsing. Pulse fading. I did not know his name. I only saw a man who was minutes away from dying on my floor. The operating room smelled like antiseptic and panic. My hands moved automatically. Clamp the artery. Compress the wound. Call for more blood. My heart pounded so hard that I could hear it in my ears, but my voice stayed calm because that is what trauma nurses learn to do. Chaos outside. Control inside. After 2 hours, the bleeding finally slowed. The surgeon looked at me with exhausted eyes and said we might actually keep him alive. The next morning I learned who he was. Kang Jun-hyuk, head of one of the most powerful Korean crime families on the West Coast. Half the men guarding his hospital room had visible scars from knife fights. The other half had guns hidden under their jackets. When he woke up 3 days later, he looked at me as if he were studying a strange animal. His voice was weak but steady when he asked if I was the nurse who refused to let him die. I told him I was simply doing my job. He stared at me for a long moment and then said something that sounded almost like a promise. A life for a life. I remember thinking it was a strange thing for a patient to say. Months passed. I returned to ordinary hospital nights, filled with car crashes and heart attacks. Then a scandal exploded across every news channel. A leaked video showed Kang Jun-hyuk orchestrating a brutal gang execution at a shipping dock. Public outrage spread quickly. Politicians demanded investigations. Investors threatened to pull away from businesses connected to his family. His empire needed something that looked human, something that looked compassionate. A few weeks later, a black sedan stopped outside my apartment. A man stepped out and delivered a message that changed my life in a single sentence. Mr. Kang would like to repay the life you saved by asking you to become his wife. The proposal did not arrive with flowers or romance. It arrived with lawyers, contracts, and 3 men in tailored black suits who looked like they had never smiled in their lives. They sat across from me in my small kitchen as if the room belonged to them. One of them calmly explained that Mr. Kang wished to repair his public image after the scandal. The media needed to see him beside someone compassionate, someone respectable, someone who represented life instead of violence. A trauma nurse who had once saved him was apparently perfect for the role. I remember staring at the papers on my table while my coffee slowly went cold. The marriage would be legal. I would live in his residence. In exchange, my student loans would disappear, my mother's medical bills would be paid, and my safety would be guaranteed. No one said the word contract marriage, but every sentence in that room sounded like one. I asked the only question that mattered to me. What happens if I refuse? The man in the suit gave a polite smile that did not reach his eyes and replied that refusing would simply mean Mr. Kang would have to solve his problem another way. I did not ask what that meant. I already understood. The wedding happened 3 weeks later. Cameras flashed outside a luxury hotel while reporters praised the story of redemption. Headlines called it proof that even the most feared man could be changed by kindness. The photographs looked almost convincing. I stood beside Kang Jun-hyuk in a white dress while he wore a perfectly tailored black suit. He held my hand gently in front of the cameras, but I noticed something immediately. His eyes never softened. Not once. It was not cruelty exactly. It was distance, like he was watching a chessboard rather than a bride. After the ceremony, he thanked me in the same calm tone he had used in the hospital. "You have done something valuable for my family today." That was the moment I understood our marriage had nothing to do with love. His house was less like a home and more like a fortress pretending to be elegant. The property sat behind high walls with cameras hidden among the trees. Guards patrolled the driveway day and night. Inside, everything was spotless, silent, controlled. Staff members moved quietly through the halls as if the building itself demanded obedience. My room was enormous, filled with expensive furniture that looked untouched by real life. The closet held clothes that had already been chosen for me by someone else. Dresses for charity galas, outfits for interviews, shoes that cost more than my monthly hospital salary. Every object in that room reminded me I had become part of a carefully designed image. Publicly, Kang Jun-hyuk played the role perfectly. He attended charity events with me, donated to hospitals, and allowed photographers to capture images of him listening seriously while I spoke about healthcare and community programs. Newspapers began printing stories about his softer side. Investors relaxed. Politicians stopped asking so many questions. To the outside world, we looked like a couple trying to build something new after a dark past. Inside the walls of the mansion, the performance ended the moment the cameras disappeared. He rarely spoke to me outside of necessary conversation. Sometimes days passed with nothing more than a quiet good morning at breakfast. He spent most nights in his office surrounded by men who spoke in low voices about shipments, territories, and negotiations that never sounded peaceful. Once I walked past the room and heard someone say the word execution in the same calm tone people normally used when discussing business plans. No one stopped me from hearing it. They simply did not care whether I understood. The first time I tried to challenge him was during dinner several months after the wedding. The house was quiet except for the faint sound of rain against the windows. I asked him directly if he ever regretted the violence that seemed to follow him everywhere. The question surprised him enough that he actually paused before answering. He set his glass down slowly and studied my face like a puzzle he had not solved yet. "Regret is for people who lose," he said. The sentence was simple, almost casual, but it chilled the room. I realized then that the man sitting across from me did not see the world the way most people did. To him, survival and power were the only measurements that mattered. Life continued like that for nearly a year. I attended events, smiled for cameras, and returned to a house where strategy replaced emotion. Sometimes I wondered if he even remembered the hospital night when I fought to keep him alive. Then one evening, everything shifted. I was walking down the hall toward the kitchen when I heard voices inside his office. The door was slightly open. His men were gathered around a large table covered with maps and photographs. One of the photos showed a young man I did not recognize. Kang Jun-hyuk's voice was quiet but unmistakable when he gave the order that froze me in place. "Prepare the hit tonight. We end their bloodline." The room answered with calm agreement. I stood in the hallway with my heart pounding, realizing that somewhere in this city a life had just been marked for death. At that moment I still believed my role in that world was only symbolic. I had no idea that before the night ended, the bleeding body of that same young man would be rushed into my hospital and placed directly under my hands. The call from the hospital came just after midnight. I was halfway through a quiet cup of tea in the kitchen when my phone vibrated across the marble counter. Night shifts had trained my body to react before my mind had time to think. Trauma incoming. Gunshot victim. Critical condition. I grabbed my coat and left the mansion without saying a word to anyone. The driver tried to ask questions during the ride downtown, but I barely heard him. My mind was already inside the emergency room, running through procedures automatically. Airway, blood pressure, hemorrhage control. Every second mattered in those cases, and hesitation could turn survival into a death certificate. By the time the car stopped outside the hospital entrance, I was already moving at a run. The emergency department exploded into motion the moment the ambulance doors opened. Paramedics rushed the stretcher inside while shouting vital signs that were dropping with every step. Blood soaked through the bandages wrapped around the patient's chest and abdomen. I grabbed a pair of gloves and followed the gurney into the trauma bay. The fluorescent lights above the table turned everything harsh and brutally clear. Someone cut open the patient's shirt while another nurse pushed 4 lines into his arms. I leaned closer to check the airway and finally saw his face. He looked younger than I expected. 19, maybe 20 at most. Dark hair soaked with sweat, skin pale from blood loss. His breathing came in shallow gasps that rattled through his chest. One of the paramedics read the name off the intake sheet while the doctors prepared to move him to surgery. Lee Min-suk. The name slammed into my thoughts like a physical blow. Even if I had never met him, I knew exactly who he was. The son of Kang Jun-hyuk's greatest rival. The heir to the Lee syndicate. The young man whose death had just been ordered hours earlier inside my husband's office. For a moment the trauma room seemed to tilt around me. The sound of monitors, beeping blended with the roar of blood rushing in my ears. I remember the calm voice I had overheard earlier that night. Prepare the hit tonight. We end their bloodline. I had assumed it would happen somewhere distant, somewhere far from my world. I had never imagined that the consequences of that order would land directly on my operating table. The attending surgeon stepped beside me and scanned the wounds quickly. 2 gunshots through the abdomen, 1 through the chest, internal bleeding likely severe. He shouted for surgical prep, and the team began pushing the stretcher toward the operating room. I followed automatically until a hand grabbed my arm and stopped me at the door. 2 men in dark suits stood in the hallway. They did not wear hospital badges. I recognized them immediately as members of Kang's security team. Their presence inside the hospital was already enough to make my stomach tighten. One of them leaned closer so the others would not hear. His voice stayed low but firm. The boss knows who the patient is. Stand down. For a moment I thought I had misunderstood him. I stared at the operating room doors where the doctors were already preparing the surgical table. The young man inside was seconds away from dying without intervention. He is a patient, I said quietly. The guard did not move. The boss said no treatment. If the boy dies tonight, the war ends. The words felt colder than the hospital air. I looked past him through the glass window into the operating room. Lee Min-suk lay motionless on the table while the surgical team waited for authorization to begin. They were confused by the delay, but had not yet questioned it. Another guard stepped forward and crossed his arms. Orders are orders. My pulse pounded in my throat. In that moment, 2 different worlds collided inside my head. One world belonged to the mansion, where strategy and loyalty determined everything. The other belonged to the hospital, where every rule I had ever sworn to follow said the same thing. A patient in front of you is a life, not a symbol. If I walked away, Kang Jun-hyuk would win his war tonight. The Lee family would lose their heir. Violence would simply move on to the next battle. If I stepped through those doors, I would be defying the man I had married and the entire system that protected him. The guard waited for my answer. His expression remained calm, as if this was just another routine instruction. Behind him, the surgical team began shouting for someone to start the procedure. Blood loss was accelerating. I looked through the glass again at the young man's face. His chest barely rose with each breath. He was not a gangster in that moment. He was simply a dying patient lying under bright hospital lights. Something inside me settled with sudden clarity. I pulled my arm free from the guard's grip and stepped past him. He tried to block the doorway, but I pushed through before he could react. The operating room filled with movement the second I entered. The surgeon turned toward me, frustration in his voice, as he demanded to know why the delay had happened. I ignored the guard shouting behind me and snapped on a fresh pair of gloves. My voice came out steady, the same tone I used in every emergency. "We're losing him," I said. "I am operating." The room exploded into motion as the team rushed to begin the procedure. Instruments clattered onto the metal tray. Monitors screamed warnings about dropping blood pressure. Outside the glass window, I could see the guards staring in disbelief. The first incision opened under the surgical lights, and blood surged across the table as the fight for the young man's life truly began. The moment the scalpel touched skin, every other thought disappeared. The operating room narrowed into a single focus, the fragile space between life and death lying open beneath the surgical lights. Blood pooled faster than expected, thick and dark against the sterile sheets. The surgeon cursed under his breath and ordered more suction while I pressed hard against the wound to slow the bleeding. Lee Min-suk's pulse dropped dangerously low on the monitor, each beep slower than the last. Someone shouted that we were losing him. I leaned closer over the table and forced my voice to stay calm. "More blood units. Now." The nurse beside me rushed to comply while the anesthesiologist adjusted medication to keep the boy stable. Every movement had to be precise. Every second mattered. Outside the glass window, the guards remained frozen in the hallway. Their faces carried a mix of shock and anger, but they did not enter the operating room. Hospitals have rules. Even men like them hesitate to break. Still, I could feel their presence like a shadow behind my back. They were waiting for the surgery to fail, waiting for the bleeding to win. The chest wound was the worst. The bullet had torn through muscle and clipped a major vessel before exiting near the ribcage. The surgeon worked quickly to expose the damage while I held retractors and suctioned blood from the field. My arms began to ache from the pressure, but I did not loosen my grip. Not once. Lee Min-suk's breathing faltered again, and the monitor screamed a warning that made the entire room tighten with urgency. The anesthesiologist shouted that we had seconds before cardiac arrest. Clamp! The surgeon finally secured the damaged artery. The bleeding slowed slightly, but the patient's blood pressure was still crashing. I moved immediately to the abdominal wounds where internal bleeding continued to spread beneath the organs. The smell of cauterized tissue filled the air as the surgeon sealed smaller vessels one by one. Sweat gathered at my temples beneath the surgical cap, but my hands remained steady. In trauma medicine, there is a moment during every critical operation where doubt creeps into the room. A silent question that no one says aloud. Are we too late? I refused to let that question settle in my mind. 30 minutes passed, then 40, then an hour. Slowly the bleeding began to stabilize. The surgical team moved with the quiet rhythm of people who knew they might actually pull someone back from the edge. Lee Min-suk's heart rate strengthened by a few precious beats. The anesthesiologist nodded slightly, relief flashing across his face. The surgeon closed the final wound and stepped back from the table, exhaustion visible in his shoulders. We have him, he said quietly. He might actually survive. For the first time since the ambulance doors had opened, the room exhaled. The monitor settled into a steady rhythm that sounded almost peaceful compared to the chaos earlier. I stepped away from the table and removed my gloves slowly, feeling the tremor finally reach my hands now that the danger had passed. Across the room, the operating lights cast a pale glow over the unconscious young man. Lee Min-suk looked impossibly small beneath the hospital blankets. Not like the heir to a crime syndicate. Just a kid who had almost died before he was old enough to understand the war he was born into. The moment the doors opened, the hallway tension rushed back in like cold air. The two guards were still waiting. Their expressions hardened when they saw the surgical team moving the patient toward the intensive care unit. One of them stepped closer to me as the gurney rolled past. He lived, the guard said quietly. Yes, I replied. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The unspoken meaning hung heavy between us. I had just interfered with a decision made by Kang Jun-hyuk himself. That kind of defiance carried consequences. The guard's phone buzzed in his pocket. He looked down at the screen, and his jaw tightened slightly before he answered the call. He listened without speaking for several moments, then glanced at me with a strange expression that mixed respect with something closer to worry. When the call ended, he slipped the phone back into his jacket. The boss knows, he said. My chest tightened despite my effort to stay calm. Of course he knew. News like this would reach him within minutes. Nothing in his world happened without information flowing directly back to him. What did he say? I asked. The guard studied me for a moment, as if weighing whether to answer honestly. Finally, he spoke in the same quiet tone. He is coming. Those 3 words carried more weight than any threat. Kang Jun-hyuk rarely appeared anywhere in person unless something mattered deeply to him. The hospital corridor suddenly felt too narrow, too exposed. I walked into the intensive care unit where Lee Min-suk had been placed under close monitoring. Machines surrounded the bed, their screens glowing softly in the dim room. His chest rose, slowly beneath the bandages, while the steady pulse on the monitor confirmed the fragile victory we had achieved. For now, he was alive. The door opened behind me about 20 minutes later. I did not need to turn around to know who had entered the room. The atmosphere changed the same way a storm alters the air before rain falls. Heavy. Electric. Kang Jun-hyuk stepped inside without a word. He wore a dark coat over a simple black shirt, his expression calm enough to be unsettling. 2 guards waited outside the doorway but did not follow him in. He walked toward the bed and looked down at the unconscious young man for several long seconds. No anger appeared on his face, no visible emotion at all. That silence somehow felt more dangerous than shouting would have been. Finally, he turned his gaze toward me. "Why?" he asked quietly. The single word hung between us like a blade. I could hear the faint rhythm of the heart monitor behind me, marking every second of the confrontation. "He was dying," I answered. Kang Jun-hyuk's eyes hardened slightly. That was the plan. I held his gaze without stepping back. In the hospital room, the rules of his world felt strangely distant. Here, the only thing that mattered was the life, still beating on the monitor. "He was a patient," I said. Silence filled the space again, thick and tense. Then his voice sharpened, just enough to reveal the anger beneath his control. "You chose my enemy." The words hung in the quiet ICU room like a challenge. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor continued behind me, each soft beep reminding both of us that the young man lying in that bed was still alive because I had chosen to act. Kang Jun-hyuk stood only a few feet away, his expression controlled, but I could see the tension beneath it. For the first time since I had known him, the perfect calm of the Mafia boss looked slightly cracked. "You chose my enemy," he repeated, his voice lower this time. I did not look away. I was tired from the surgery, my arm still aching, but something inside me refused to bend now that the decision had already been made. "I chose my patient," I said. His jaw tightened slightly. "You interfered with something that has been building for 10 years. I glanced at the young man in the hospital bed. Lee Min-suk's breathing was slow but stable beneath the machines surrounding him. His life, which had nearly disappeared under bright surgical lights an hour earlier, now continued quietly in the room. Then I turned back to my husband, because I am tired of being the only human being in a house full of strategy. The sentence left my mouth before I had time to soften it. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to press against the walls. Kang Jun-hyuk did not move. His eyes searched my face as if he were hearing a language he had never learned before. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked back toward the bed. The young man who was supposed to die tonight now lay alive because of the woman Kang had married to protect his reputation. The irony was impossible to ignore. "You just ended this war differently than I planned," he said quietly. "I ended nothing," I replied. "I just refused to let someone die on my table." He studied me again, but this time something else flickered in his eyes. Not anger, something closer to confusion. Without another word, he turned toward the door. For a second I thought the conversation was finished, but he paused before leaving. "You should go home," he said. I shook my head slowly. "I am staying until my patient is stable." Another long silence passed. Then Kang Jun-hyuk gave a small nod, as if acknowledging a rule that existed outside his world. He walked out of the ICU without another word. Through the glass wall, I watched him disappear down the hospital corridor, his dark coat blending into the dim lights of the hallway. For the first time since our marriage, I realized something important. Power had never truly been the strongest force in his life. It was simply the only one he understood. And tonight, for the first time, someone had forced him to face a different kind of power. Lee Min-suk survived the night. 2 days later, the news spread quietly through the city's underworld. The heir of the Lee syndicate was alive, and the war everyone expected to explode suddenly went silent. No retaliation came. No new blood spilled. Weeks later, I heard the reason through whispers in the hospital corridors. The Lee family had called Kang Jun-hyuk personally. A life had been returned, so the war would end there. Sometimes mercy does what violence never can. As for Kang, he did not come back to the hospital for several days. When he finally did, he stood beside the window of the ICU and watched the machines for a long time without speaking. I do not know if he changed that day, but for the first time since I met him, he looked less like a king of a battlefield and more like a man trying to understand the cost of it. And now I want to ask you something. If you were in my place, would you have saved the enemy's son, or would you have followed your husband's war? Tell me in the comments. If this story made you think, do not forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves powerful stories about justice, choices, and consequences.